Karen always had a way of making everything about her. It wasn't something that had bothered me much over the years. Sometimes I even found it entertaining. But this year, her 50th birthday was different. She insisted on a big celebration, an over-the-top golden jubilee, as she called it. She went all out. Rented a lavish party hall, hired a planner, spent what looked like a small fortune on catering and decorations. She seemed determined to make it unforgettable. For some reason, she didn't want my help in planning. I found it strange, but she brushed me off with a sugary smile and said, "Tom, you just make it boring. Trust me. Let me handle it." I should have seen that as a red flag, but instead, I just stepped back and let her do her thing. After all, who was I to spoil her big day? That evening, the party was everything she had promised. Flashy, loud, and packed with people. People I hardly even recognized. Some old friends, yes, but plenty of faces I didn't know. I remember scanning the room and noticing that Karen seemed almost glued to a small group of her friends. She was laughing, drinking, clearly having the time of her life, while I was stuck entertaining her second cousins at a table near the buffet. The real twist came when she disappeared halfway through the night. One moment she was there, dancing in her golden dress, shining as brightly as she always thought she deserved. The next, she was nowhere to be seen. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where she'd gone. Her best friend, Linda, had that smug look on her face, the kind people have when they know something you don't. She waved me off and said Karen must have gone to freshen up or grab a drink, but it didn't sit right with me. Something was wrong. I decided to leave the table of half-interested party guests and go look for her. I scanned the hallway, then checked the back rooms of the venue. Eventually, I found her outside, in the parking lot, but she wasn't alone. She was there with some guy in a cheap suit with his hands all over her. They were too close, too comfortable. I felt a shock run through my body, an electric pulse of disbelief. I froze. Time seemed to stretch out, and all I could do was watch each second cutting deeper. Karen had her back to me, but the guy noticed me almost instantly. He must have seen the rage in my eyes because he quickly stepped away, muttering something to her. She turned around, her face contorting in a mix of surprise and irritation, like I was the one who was interrupting her night. "Oh, Tom," she said, without a hint of guilt in her voice. "You weren't supposed to see this." I wasn't supposed to see this? That was her explanation? I felt something snap inside me, the betrayal slamming into my chest like a sledgehammer. "What the hell is going on, Karen?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. She sighed, like she was tired, as if this whole mess was somehow my fault. "Can you calm down, Tom? You're making a scene," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. The guy, the stranger, looked at me, then at her and took a few steps back, clearly not wanting any part of whatever was about to happen. "Making a scene?" I repeated, my fists clenched so tight I thought my fingers would break. "You're out here with some guy on your birthday, and I'm making a scene?" She rolled her eyes, the same dismissive look she'd given me 100 times lately. "Look, I wanted one night for myself, all right? One night without you breathing down my neck, without your dull conversations, without the same boring routine." She laughed, a bitter edge to her voice. "It's my 50th, Tom. I wanted to actually feel alive for once." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just cheating. It was deliberate, calculated disrespect, right in front of me, without a shred of remorse. She didn't care. She wasn't sorry, and she wasn't even trying to hide it properly. It was as if she wanted me to find out, like this was her twisted way of punishing me for something I couldn't even name. A part of me wanted to hit that guy. Another part of me just wanted to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't move. I stood there, staring at her, this person I had shared 20 years of my life with, wondering how she could turn into a stranger overnight. Standing there, in that freezing parking lot, it felt like the world had slipped from beneath my feet. Karen, my wife of 20 years, was standing there with that guy, looking at me like I was the one in the wrong. Her words still echoed in my mind. I wanted one night for myself. One night? Was that all it took to burn down everything we had built together? But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "Is this what makes you feel alive, Karen?" I snapped, pointing at the guy who was now inching away, trying to fade into the background. Sneaking around, hooking up with some random dude at your own party? You think this is what freedom feels like? My voice was shaking, but I didn't care anymore who heard us. Let everyone in the hall hear this. Let Linda hear it. Let all her smug friends hear it. Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. You know what, Tom? She stepped forward, her voice lowering, almost like she was trying to make sure only I could hear. You've always been so predictable, so boring. You think this house, this perfect life you're always talking about, means anything to me? You think I want to keep living like this? She waved her hand dismissively, the lights from the venue reflecting off her golden dress. It's suffocating. That cut deep. I had spent years working myself to the bone for that so-called boring life she was complaining about. I remembered the late nights at the office, the extra shifts, all to provide for our family, all to make sure Karen and the kids never wanted for anything. And here she was, throwing it back in my face as if it was all worthless. You know what's suffocating, Karen? I took a step toward her, feeling the heat rising in my chest, anger and disbelief blending into something almost blinding. Living with someone who acts like you're just an accessory. I loved you. I did everything for you, for this family. But clearly, that's not good enough for Queen Karen. Huh. She didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed amused, a crooked smile forming on her lips. You always had such a martyr complex, she said, almost laughing. You think you're some hero just because you work a 9-to-5 and pay the bills? Newsflash, Tom, that's the bare minimum of being a husband. And honestly, I deserve more than just the bare minimum. That was it. The moment I realized she wasn't the person I had fallen in love with 2 decades ago. The woman I had married was someone who cared, who laughed with me, who shared my dreams. But this person standing in front of me was cold, indifferent, someone who seemed to take pleasure in seeing me fall apart. I realized then that Karen had changed, maybe long before tonight, and I had been too blind to see it. I could feel the weight of everything, 20 years of memories, the love I had given, the sacrifices I had made, pressing down on me. All those moments, all those times I thought we were happy, suddenly felt tainted, like I had been living in a lie. And in that moment, the anger turned to something else. Clarity. You know what? I said, my voice dropping. I looked her right in the eye, and for the first time I didn't see my wife there, just a stranger in a golden dress. You're right. Maybe I've been too predictable. Maybe I've been too blind to see who you really are. But if you want more than the bare minimum, Karen, go ahead and take it. Because I'm done. I'm done trying to please someone who can't even respect me enough to keep her vows. She opened her mouth, but before she could say another word, I turned and walked away. I could hear her calling after me, her voice laced with annoyance more than regret. Tom, don't be so dramatic, she yelled, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the doors of the venue, back into the noisy hall where the party was still in full swing. The music was pounding, the lights were flashing, and yet all I felt was this deafening silence in my chest. Linda spotted me almost immediately, her smile faltering as she saw my expression. She tried to say something, but I didn't have the patience. Tell Karen I'm taking the car, I said curtly, brushing past her and heading for the exit. I needed to get out of there, away from all of this. I needed air. I got in the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I drove, the city lights blurring past, my mind racing, memories flashing before me like a film reel on fire. All the late nights when she was working late, all the girls' nights she claimed she needed. How many lies had she told me? How long had she been doing this behind my back? Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see Karen's name lighting up the screen, her text short and cold. Stop overreacting. Come back, and we'll talk about this. Overreacting. I let out a bitter laugh, almost losing control of the car for a moment. She really thought she could still manipulate me, still make this my fault. No, not anymore. I ignored the text, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and just kept driving, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite process yet. Somewhere in the distance, I could see the first signs of dawn breaking, the sky slowly lightening. A new day was coming, and I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, I was done letting Karen dictate my life. This was the beginning of something new, and I was going to find a way to come out of this stronger, no matter what it took. The sun had barely risen when I finally pulled into the driveway. I'd driven around for hours, the city transforming from a cold, dark labyrinth to the soft light of morning. I didn't even know how I'd ended up back at home. Somewhere in the chaos of my thoughts, the car had just taken me here, like muscle memory. But stepping into the house didn't bring the comfort I had hoped for. It was just a hollow shell, filled with memories that now felt tarnished. I walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed the strongest whiskey we had, and poured myself a glass. I could feel the exhaustion in my bones, but I knew sleep wouldn't come. The tension was electric, buzzing beneath my skin, refusing to let go. Every corner of the house seemed to mock me, reminders of what I thought was a happy life. Then I noticed Karen's laptop on the dining table. She always left it there, plugged in and ready for her next round of emails. Normally, I would never even think of touching her things. We respected each other's space. But last night had shattered any illusion of trust we'd once had. I wasn't in the mood for respecting boundaries anymore. I sat down and flipped it open, the screen glowing to life. There was a password prompt. I stared at it, hesitating for a second, and then tried the obvious one, our daughter's name. The screen unlocked instantly. For a moment, I almost laughed at how cliché it was. For all her deception, Karen was still predictable in some ways. I knew what I was looking for, her messages. I wanted proof. Proof that what I had seen wasn't just a nightmare, something I could convince myself was a mistake. I clicked through her emails, her work documents, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found a folder tucked away, simply named Personal. When I opened it, my heart sank. There were emails, dozens of them, dating back months. Messages to and from a guy named Greg. Each one was like a punch to the gut. They were full of plans, exchanges of secrets, inside jokes that I didn't understand. And pictures. Pictures of the two of them together at bars, at restaurants, smiling, his arm around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. In one photo, Karen wore that same golden dress, the one from her birthday, leaning in close to him with a smile that she hadn't given me in years. I scrolled further, my stomach churning with every new message. It wasn't just some fling. This was a relationship. She had taken vacations with him. Weekends, she had told me, were business trips. She'd even introduced him to some of her friends, Linda included. All of them had known. They had all smiled at me, shaken my hand, all while keeping her secret. And then I found one message that made my blood run cold. It was from last week, Karen writing to Greg. "I think it's almost time. He's getting suspicious. Let's just get through my birthday, and then we can figure out how to make things permanent." Permanent. The word echoed in my head, and I felt something snap inside me. She wasn't just cheating. She was planning to leave me. She was planning to replace me. All the times I had tried to connect with her, to make things better, she had already made up her mind. Every smile she gave me, every time she reassured me that everything was fine, it was all an act. The front door opened, and I heard Karen's voice calling out, "Tom, are you home?" She walked in, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, her tone too cheerful, too normal, like nothing had happened last night. I didn't answer, still staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. When she stepped into the kitchen and saw me sitting there with her laptop open, her face paled. She knew instantly what I had found. "Tom," she said, her voice faltering for the first time. "What are you doing?" I looked up at her, the anger I'd been holding back finally boiling over. "How long, Karen?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How long have you been lying to me, planning this behind my back?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over, trying to close the laptop, but I slammed it shut before she could touch it. "Don't you dare," I snapped, standing up. "Don't you dare try to hide this now." Karen's face twisted, her initial shock giving way to annoyance. "You shouldn't have gone through my things, Tom. This is private. It's none of your business." "None of my business?" I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You're my wife, and you're planning to leave me for some guy named Greg? You think that's none of my business?" She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe if you'd paid more attention, you would have noticed that I wasn't happy, Tom. You've been so wrapped up in your own little world. Work, The house, the kids. You didn't even see that I needed more. Greg gives me that. He makes me feel like I matter. I could feel my hands trembling, my vision blurring with anger. I gave you everything, Karen. I worked my ass off for this family. For you. And you just threw it away? For what? Some thrill? Some guy who makes you feel special? She shook her head, almost pityingly. You just don't get it. You never did. I need more than just security. I need passion, excitement, things you can't give me anymore. I took a step back, the weight of her words hitting me like a blow to the chest. Then why didn't you just leave? I asked, my voice cracking. Why string me along? Let me think we could fix things? She looked away, her expression hardening. Because I wanted to make sure I was ready. I wanted to make sure Greg was ready. I couldn't just walk out without a plan. The coldness in her voice was the final straw. This was no longer the woman I had loved, the mother of my children. This was someone else, someone calculating and self-serving, who had stayed just long enough to make sure she had a safety net before discarding me. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. Get out, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, but then she seemed to understand that I wasn't going to argue anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps fading up the stairs. I heard her packing, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of clothes being thrown into a bag. I stood there, staring at the laptop, the screen now dark, but the weight of everything I had seen still hanging over me. I knew there was no going back now. This was the end of our marriage, the end of everything I had thought was real. And as much as it hurt, as much as it broke me, I knew that I couldn't let her control my life any longer. This was the moment I had to take back my power, to decide my own future. Without Karen, without the lies, it was time to start over, whatever that meant. And as she finally left the house, slamming the door behind her, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm had passed, and now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces. The moment Karen walked out the door, an unexpected silence filled the house. I thought I'd feel empty, shattered maybe, but instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity, almost a calm. Everything was different now, and the rules had changed. This wasn't about saving anything anymore. It was about surviving and taking back control of my life. It was time to be strategic, something Karen would never see coming. I took a long breath and leaned against the counter. My phone was still lying on the table where I tossed it the night before. I grabbed it, ignoring the missed calls and messages from Karen. Instead, I opened a new message and typed out a text to the one person who might be able to shed more light on this mess. Linda, we need to talk. Now, it only took a few minutes before Linda responded. I'm at home. Come over. The idea of confronting Linda filled me with a mix of rage and determination. She had smiled at me, hugged me even, while knowing the whole time what was going on. The betrayal wasn't just from Karen. It was from everyone who had been complicit. Everyone who thought they could play a part in destroying my life while pretending to be a friend. I got into my car and drove to Linda's place. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, and as I pulled up, I could see her standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of apprehension and guilt. She knew why I was here. I got out of the car and walked up to her without a word. She stepped back, letting me in, and closed the door behind us. The moment the door clicked shut, I turned to face her. How long? I asked, my voice low but steady. I didn't have the patience for games or pleasantries. How long have you known about Karen and Greg? Linda looked down, wringing her hands nervously. Tom, Don't try to justify it, Linda. Just tell me the truth. I cut her off, my eyes locked on hers. She swallowed, her face pale. A few months. Karen. She told me she wasn't happy. She said you two were drifting apart, and she found someone who made her feel alive again. I tried to tell her to end it, Tom, I swear I did. But she wouldn't listen. She told me it was what she wanted. The words hit like a gut punch. It was one thing to hear it from Karen, but knowing she'd confided in Linda and still gone on like everything was fine made it worse. I took a step closer, my eyes narrowing. And you thought it was okay to just keep that from me? To stand there at her party, smiling at me, knowing what she was doing? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. I didn't know what else to do, Tom. She's my best friend. She told me not to say anything, and I thought maybe it would blow over. I didn't want to ruin everything. Well, congratulations, Linda, I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. Everything's ruined now anyway, but you know what? Maybe you can help fix it. She looked up at me, confused. What do you mean? I paced around the living room, the gears in my mind starting to turn. You've known about Greg. You've probably met him, right? You know where he lives. Linda hesitated, her eyes widening slightly. Tom, what are you planning to do? I let out a slow breath, trying to keep the rage in check. I'm not going to do anything illegal, if that's what you're thinking, but I need information. I need to know everything about this guy. Where he lives, what he does, what Karen has planned with him. You owe me that much. For a moment, Linda just stared at me, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between loyalty to Karen and the guilt of betraying me. Finally, she nodded, almost reluctantly. Okay, she whispered. I'll tell you what I know. But, Tom, please, promise me you won't do anything that will get you into trouble. Karen made her choice, but you need to think about yourself now. About your kids. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the sharp sting of reality. My kids. This wasn't just about Karen and Greg and their lies. This was about my family, about what came next. If I made the wrong move, they'd be the ones caught in the middle. I nodded slowly. I'm not going to do anything reckless, but I need to make sure Karen doesn't get away with this without consequences. She doesn't get to just walk away and pretend like she didn't destroy everything. Linda sat down on the couch and started talking, hesitantly at first, but then with more confidence as she realized I wasn't about to lose control. She told me about Greg. He was a colleague of Karen's from some consulting firm, someone she'd met during one of those work weekends that she had supposedly been attending. He lived a few towns over, in a small house that they'd apparently used as their little love nest. Linda had seen them together once, at a dinner Karen had arranged, and she'd known instantly what was going on. Every detail felt like another betrayal, but I listened, committing it all to memory. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but I knew that I couldn't just let this slide. Karen had wanted to make her move permanent. Well, it was time I made some moves of my own. After Linda finished, she looked at me, her eyes full of regret. I'm sorry, Tom. I should have told you. I should have done something. I stood up, the weight of everything pressing down on me, but for the first time, I also felt a sense of direction. You should have, I agreed, but at least you're helping now. And trust me, Linda, I'm not going to let Karen walk away from this without facing the consequences. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes, and I turned to leave. As I stepped out of her apartment, the cool morning air hit me, and I took a deep breath. This was far from over. Karen had played her cards, and now it was my turn. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her rewrite my life on her terms. I was going to take control one step at a time and make sure that when this was all said and done, she would regret every single lie, every moment of betrayal. There were still cards to be played, and I intended to play them well. The drive back from Linda's felt different. The anger was still there, pulsing underneath the surface, but there was something else too. A sense of focus, of control. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, I knew what I had to do. When I reached home, the house was as empty as I'd left it, the silence almost welcoming now. I walked in and went straight to the office, the small room where I kept my documents, papers, and everything that mattered for the family. I wasn't about to let Karen take what I had worked for. This wasn't going to be a story where she waltzed off into the sunset with some Greg while I got stuck cleaning up the mess. No, if she wanted to play dirty, then I'd get ready to fight. I pulled out all the paperwork I could find, bank statements, deeds, anything with our names on it. The more I went through, the more I realized how intertwined our lives were. Everything, from the house to the accounts to the small vacation property we'd bought years ago, was connected. But there were details, small cracks that I could widen. I found the number of a divorce lawyer I'd heard about from a friend a few years back. A tough, no-nonsense type who didn't believe in losing. At the time, I had never thought I'd need that number, but here I was, punching it into my phone. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Law Office of Martha Hayes. How can I assist you? I cleared my throat, my voice steady. I need to speak with Martha. It's about filing for divorce. And I need someone who knows how to make sure I don't get screwed over. The assistant put me on hold, and a few moments later, Martha came on the line. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it. The kind of tone that told me she'd seen everything before and wasn't afraid of a fight. Mr. Reeves, I understand you're looking for representation. Why don't you start by telling me what's going on? I took a deep breath, and then I let it all out. The affair, the betrayal, Karen's plans to leave. Martha listened quietly, interrupting only to ask a few pointed questions. When I was done, there was a pause, and then she spoke. Tom, I'm going to be honest with you. You're in a good position here, especially if you can prove the infidelity. Judges don't look kindly on spouses who break their vows and then try to profit from it. If you're ready to fight, I'll make sure you keep what's yours. It was exactly what I needed to hear. I'm ready, I said. I'm not going to let her walk away from this without consequences. Good, Martha replied. First things first, gather any evidence you have, texts, emails, anything that shows the affair. The more proof, the stronger our case. And we're going to freeze the accounts so she doesn't drain them before we get to court. I'll send you a list of what I need, and we'll take it from there. I hung up feeling a sense of purpose. Karen had made her move, but she hadn't counted on me fighting back. She thought I'd crumble, that I'd be too shocked or too broken to do anything but let her have her way. She had no idea who she was dealing with now. I spent the rest of the day collecting everything I could. The emails from her laptop, screenshots of the messages, bank statements showing unusual expenses. It felt almost clinical, like I was gathering evidence for someone else's life. The emotions, the heartbreak, the anger were still there, but now they were wrapped in a cold determination. Later that evening, I got a call from Linda. She sounded hesitant, unsure if she should even be calling. Tom, I just wanted to check on you. I know everything's a mess right now, and I feel terrible about all of it. I paused, considering how to respond. Linda had been a part of this, yes, but she was also my only link to what Karen was planning. And if I was going to come out of this without losing everything, I needed all the information I could get. I'm managing, I said finally, keeping my tone even. But Linda, I need you to be straight with me. Karen mentioned she was planning something after her birthday, something permanent. Do you know what she meant by that? There was silence on the other end, and I could almost hear Linda's hesitation. Finally, she spoke. She was planning to move in with Greg. She said she wanted to wait until after her birthday to tell you, to make it official. She wanted to sell the vacation property and use the money to start fresh with him. I clenched my jaw, the anger flaring up again. She was planning to take what we had built together, sell it, and use it for her new life? Not on my watch. Thanks for telling me, I said, my voice cold. I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. Tom, please be careful, Linda said, her voice soft. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but just don't do anything that will make things worse. I didn't respond to that. I ended the call and sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Karen thought she could get away with this, that she could steal from me, from our family, and run off to play house with Greg. She thought she could make me the fool. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Meetings with Martha, freezing the accounts, ensuring that Karen couldn't touch anything without my say-so. Every time I felt the sting of betrayal, I channeled it into action. Every time I remembered Karen's dismissive smile, I worked harder to make sure she would regret underestimating me. And then came the moment I was waiting for. Karen called me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Tom, we need to talk. I think it's time we discuss how to move forward. Peacefully. She really thought I'd roll over and give her what she wanted. Sure, Karen, I replied, keeping my voice calm. Why don't you come by the house tomorrow? We'll talk about everything. She agreed, clearly thinking she was still in control, still holding all the cards. But when she walked through that door the next day, she was in for a rude awakening. I had everything ready, the paperwork, the evidence, and Martha's advice echoing in my ears. I wasn't just going to protect what was mine. I was going to make sure Karen understood exactly what she had thrown away. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it head-on. The day had finally arrived. Karen texted that morning to confirm the meeting, and her message read as if this was a friendly discussion. Like two people casually parting ways. Couldn't help but laugh when I read it. The audacity she had, the nerve to think she still had control over how this would go. She had underestimated me, and that was her biggest mistake. I made sure everything was ready. The living room was cleared except for a stack of papers and folders on the coffee table. The documentation of her affair with Greg, the financial documents showing the expenses she had tried to hide, and most importantly, a copy of the preliminary divorce papers that Martha had drawn up. I wanted to make sure Karen knew I wasn't going to be played. When she arrived, she walked in wearing that same confident expression. Her shoulders squared as if she was the one in charge. She had a small purse tucked under her arm and wore a dress I vaguely remembered her buying a few weeks back. A dress she probably thought would impress me, maybe soften me up. I wasn't moved. "Tom," she began, a fake smile plastered on her face. "Thank you for agreeing to talk. I know things have been tense, and I really want us to handle this as adults." I motioned for her to sit down, pointing to the chair opposite where I stood. "Sure, Karen. Let's handle this as adults." She gave me a slightly puzzled look, as if she didn't expect this seriousness, and sat down. I remained standing, staring down at her, every muscle in my body tense. I watched as her eyes shifted to the folders on the coffee table. I could see the recognition there. Her face faltered for just a second before she caught herself. "So," she said, crossing her legs, trying to maintain composure, "I think we should start by discussing how to divide our assets. I want to make sure this is fair for both of us." I almost laughed. "Fair?" I picked up one of the folders and tossed it in front of her. "Is that what you were thinking about when you decided to have an affair with Greg?" Karen's eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw the mask slip. Shock, fear, then annoyance flashed across her face. "Tom, I don't know what you think you know, but save it," I interrupted, my voice cutting through hers. "I know everything, Karen. I know about Greg, I know about your plans to move in with him, and I know you were planning to use our money, my money, to fund your new life. So don't sit there and pretend like this is some amicable separation." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I watched as she struggled to find a defense, something that could put her back in control. But she had nothing. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the back of the chair in front of me. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign these preliminary divorce papers," I said, tapping the stack of documents, "and you're going to agree to my terms. You're not getting the house. You're not getting the vacation property. And you're not touching the accounts." Her eyes narrowed, her face hardening. "You can't be serious, Tom. You think you can just dictate how this goes? I have rights. I have. You have nothing?" I cut her off again, my voice cold. "You violated our marriage. You lied, you cheated, and you tried to steal from me. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and trust me, Karen, I have enough evidence to make sure you walk away with the bare minimum. So unless you want a long, ugly court battle that ends with you even worse off, I suggest you sit down and listen." For a moment, she looked at me, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and disbelief. This wasn't the Tom she thought she knew, the one who would roll over, the one she could manipulate. I could see the realization dawn on her face that she had miscalculated. Her voice came out quieter now, a hint of desperation in it. "Tom, we've been married for 20 years. We have kids together. Are you really going to throw everything away over one mistake?" "One mistake," I repeated, incredulous. I could feel the anger boiling up again, but I forced myself to stay calm. "This wasn't a mistake, Karen. This was a choice. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, to make a fool of me. You made those choices over and over again. And now you want to sit here and ask for mercy." I watched as her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She looked down at the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for them. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of everything settling between us. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me, Tom?" I paused, considering her question. What did I want? Revenge, justice, closure? Maybe all of those things, but most of all, I wanted my life back. A life where I wasn't living under the shadow of someone else's betrayal. "I want you out," I said finally, my voice firm. "I want you to pack your things and leave." You can go be with Greg, do whatever you want, but you're not staying here. You're not taking any more from me." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked almost like the woman I used to know. The one I had loved, the one I had built a life with. But it was just a moment, a fleeting glimpse, and then it was gone, replaced by the stranger she had become. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "Fine," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'll sign. I'll leave. But I hope you know this won't make you happy, Tom. Holding on to all this anger, it's just going to eat you alive." I straightened up, looking down at her with a calmness that surprised even me. "Maybe, but at least I'll know I didn't let you destroy me." She picked up the pen, her hand shaking slightly as she signed the papers. When she was done, she stood up, avoiding my gaze as she walked to the door. She paused for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but then she shook her head and walked out, the door closing softly behind her. And just like that, it was over. I stood there, the papers in my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and though everything had changed, I was still standing. Karen was gone. The lies, the betrayal, all of it was out of my life now. It was time to rebuild, to focus on what mattered. My kids, my future, and the life I still had ahead of me. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and pain. But as I looked around the quiet, empty house, I knew one thing for sure. I was done being the victim. This was my life, and I was taking it back, one step at a time. After Karen left, the house fell into a kind of silence that was both comforting and unsettling. For the first time in a long while, I had space to breathe, but that space also echoed with the absence of everything I thought my life had been. I knew the hardest part was still ahead of me. Picking up the pieces, reestablishing a sense of normalcy, and, most importantly, breaking the news to the kids. Our kids, Emily and James, were the reason I had to tread carefully now. They were both young adults, Emily in her second year of college and James just finishing up high school. They had always looked up to Karen and me as a united front, as an unbreakable team. And I knew, no matter how angry or betrayed I felt, they were going to be blindsided by this. Their world was about to change, and I wanted to make sure they knew I was still their rock. Took me a day to gather the courage. I called Emily first, asking her to come home for the weekend. I didn't tell her why. I knew she'd worry if I did, and I didn't want her distracted or upset until I could explain it in person. James, of course, was already at home, but I kept my distance until I could have both of them in the same room. I wasn't going to do this twice. When Emily arrived, I watched her step out of her car, her face lighting up when she saw me. She was still my little girl, no matter how grown she looked, and that smile made my heart twist with both love and guilt. I knew I was about to shatter part of her world, and it took every ounce of strength I had to keep my own emotions under control. "Dad!" she called out, jogging over and giving me a tight hug. "What's up? You sounded kind of serious on the phone. Everything okay?" I smiled at her, hugging her back tightly. "Hey, sweetheart. We need to talk, and I want James here too. Let's go inside." She looked puzzled, but she followed me inside. I called James down from his room, and soon we were all gathered in the living room, the same room where Karen had sat just days earlier, signing away our life together. The kids sat on the couch, watching me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. I stood in front of them, my hands resting on the back of a chair for support. I had thought about how to say this over and over, and I still didn't have the perfect words, so I just started with the truth. "I need to tell you both something important," I began, taking a deep breath. "Your mom and we're getting a divorce." Emily's face fell, her eyes widening in shock. James, on the other hand, just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite process what I was saying. "What?" Emily finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why? What happened?" I sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "Your mom, she made some choices that hurt me and hurt our family. She's been seeing someone else, and it's not something we can come back from." James clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "She cheated on you?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Mom did that." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I wish I didn't have to tell you this, but I want you both to know the truth. I want you to understand that this isn't your fault. None of this is because of you. Your mom and I, we just can't stay together after what's happened." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, her shoulders shaking. "But what about us? What about our family?" I walked over and knelt in front of them, reaching out to take their hands. "We're still a family," I said firmly. "Nothing will ever change that. I love you both more than anything, and I will always be here for you. I know this is going to be hard. I know it's going to hurt, but I promise you we're going to get through this. Together." For a moment, there was only silence, the weight of my words settling over all of us. Then Emily let out a soft sob, and I pulled her into a hug, James joining us, his face pressed against my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other, the three of us united in our grief and our love. That night, we ordered takeout, and we ate together in the living room, sharing stories and memories, trying to bring some light into the darkness. Emily and James asked questions. Where would their mom live? How often would they see her? What would happen to the house? I answered as best as I could, even though I didn't have all the answers. I told them that Karen would be staying elsewhere for now, that we would figure out the logistics in time. I didn't want to lie to them, but I also didn't want to paint Karen as a complete villain. She was still their mother, and no matter what she had done to me, I knew they needed to make their own decisions about her. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed in her old room and James had retreated upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the stack of legal papers. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful one. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of betrayal anymore. It was the calm after the storm, the kind that let you know you had survived something that could have destroyed you. I knew there was still a long road ahead. The divorce proceedings would be messy, and there would be days when the pain of what Karen had done would feel like too much to bear. But I also knew that I had something worth fighting for. My kids, my life, the future I could build for myself without the weight of lies and betrayal dragging me down. Before I went to bed, I sent a quick message to Martha. I've told the kids. Let's move forward with the paperwork. I'm ready. She responded almost immediately. Understood. Let's get you through this. As I lay down that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind of hope that everything would magically get better, but a quiet, steady belief that I had the strength to rebuild. That no matter how much Karen had taken from me, she hadn't taken everything. The next chapter of my life was beginning, and for the first time I was ready to write it on my own terms. Without Karen, without the lies, just me and the two people who mattered the most, facing whatever came next. Together. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new kind of routine. The divorce process moved forward, each step another nail in the coffin of my old life. Martha was relentless, and I was grateful for her toughness. She made sure that Karen wouldn't be able to walk away with what we had built without facing the consequences. Each meeting with Martha felt like reclaiming a part of myself, a part that Karen had tried to strip away. Karen moved out into a small apartment across town. She asked if we could meet to talk again, but I declined. Everything we needed to discuss could be handled through our lawyers. There was nothing left to say. I kept my distance, and so did she, though she tried to reach out to the kids. I made sure they knew they could see her whenever they wanted, but I wouldn't be the one to arrange it. They were old enough to decide on their own terms, and I wasn't going to force anything. Emily decided to visit her once, but I could tell by her expression when she returned that it hadn't gone well. She was quiet for the rest of the evening, lost in her thoughts. James, on the other hand, refused to see Karen at all. He was angry, angrier than I had expected, and it was hard to watch him wrestle with that betrayal. But I knew better than to push him. He needed time, and I would be there for him however long it took. Despite the chaos, there were moments of light, moments where I could see that we were healing, slowly but surely. One evening, I came home from work to find James in the kitchen, trying to cook dinner. He had a recipe pulled up on his phone, the counter cluttered with ingredients, and he looked at me with a sheepish grin when I walked in. Thought I'd try making something for a change, he said, shrugging. Figured you could use a break. I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. Need any help? I asked, walking over to inspect the mess he'd made. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt a warmth spread through the house. a sense that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. Emily, too, found her own ways to cope. She started spending more weekends at home, taking long walks with me in the mornings, talking about her classes, her friends, her plans for the future. One morning, as we walked through the neighborhood, she reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You know, Dad," she said, her voice soft, "I always thought you and Mom had it all figured out, but seeing how you've handled this, it makes me realize how strong you are. I'm proud of you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, blinking back tears. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Each day was a small victory, reclaiming the house, the routines, the joy that had once filled our lives. I threw myself into work, not as an escape, but as a way to rebuild. I found satisfaction in the projects I took on, a sense of purpose that reminded me of who I was outside of being a husband. I even started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. It felt good to sweat, to push myself physically, to feel my body coming back to life after being numb for so long. And then there were the friends, people who had been on the sidelines of my life, watching as I'd been swallowed by the demands of marriage and work, slowly began to reappear. My old friend Dave invited me out for drinks one Friday night, and I accepted, not knowing how much I needed it until I was sitting at the bar, laughing over a beer, the weight of everything momentarily lifted. "So, how's the single life treating you?" Dave asked, nudging me with his elbow, a knowing smile on his face. I shook my head, chuckling. "It's different, but honestly, feels good. I'm starting to remember who I am." "That's the spirit," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings, my friend. To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. One evening, a few weeks after Karen had moved out, I found myself alone in the house. Emily had gone back to college, and James was out with his friends. The quiet didn't feel so heavy anymore. It felt peaceful, like a chance to just be with myself without the weight of everything that had happened. I walked through the house, room by room, looking at the photos on the walls, the pieces of our life that had once told the story of a happy family. I took down some of the pictures, ones of Karen and me, ones that felt too painful to keep up. But I left the ones of us with the kids, the ones where we were all smiling together. Those moments had been real, and I wanted to remember them for what they were, good times that weren't tainted by what had come after. Eventually, I made my way out to the backyard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and I sat down on the old wooden bench I had built years ago. Creaked under my weight, but it held just like I had. I looked out at the garden, at the flowers that were just starting to bloom, and I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs. It was strange, this new life. There were still moments when the loneliness hit, when I missed the idea of what Karen and I had once been. But those moments were becoming fewer, replaced by something else, a sense of possibility, of hope. For so long, my life had been defined by the roles I played: husband, father, provider. Now, I was learning to define myself again on my own terms. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready to face it. I had my kids, I had my friends, and most importantly, I had myself. I took out my phone, opening up a note I had written weeks ago, back when everything had felt impossible. It was a list of things I wanted to do, small goals, simple pleasures I had forgotten about in the chaos of life. I smiled as I read through it. Take a road trip, learn to play the guitar, spend a whole day fishing, just because. There was still so much to do, so much life left to live, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about it. I might have lost what I thought my life would be, but I hadn't lost myself. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It was time to start again, to build something new from the ground up. And this time, I was going to make sure it was built on truth, on strength, and on the unbreakable bond one shared with the people who mattered most. No lies, no betrayal, just a life that was real and finally truly mine.